Good evening. We begin tonight with a stark warning from Tehran that has sent shockwaves through global capitals. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has declared that any attack by the United States would ignite a regional war across the Middle East. This direct threat, issued just yesterday, comes as American warships, led by the USS Abraham Lincoln, are steaming toward regional waters. The world is now watching a dangerous escalation between Washington and Tehran, with President Donald Trump having repeatedly threatened military action over Iran's crackdown on recent protests. Tonight, we take a deep dive into what this means for global security, for America's allies, and for the delicate balance of power in the world's most volatile region. I'm your host, and this is Kenya News Update Today. Let's first understand the immediate context. On Sunday, February 1st, the 86-year-old Ayatollah Khamenei made his most direct threat yet. Through the semi-official Tasnim news agency, and in posts on the social media platform X, he stated, and I quote, "The Americans should know that if they start a war, this time it will be a regional war." He dismissed American talk of warships and aircraft as nothing new, claiming the Iranian nation is not affected by such rhetoric. Crucially, he framed this as a defensive posture, saying, "We are not the instigators, we are not going to be unfair to anyone, we don't plan to attack any country. But if anyone shows greed and wants to attack or harass, the Iranian nation will deal a heavy blow to them." This warning is not happening in a vacuum. It follows a week of heightened tensions, with President Trump last week threatening to use military force if the Iranian government's crackdown on nationwide protests continued. The U.S. has also accused Iran of destabilizing activities across the region, from supporting militant groups to advancing its nuclear program. The deployment of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is a tangible manifestation of that pressure. So, what exactly is Khamenei threatening? He's not just talking about Iran fighting back. He's explicitly warning that Iran's response would not be contained within its borders. It would be a regional war, implying the activation of Iran's network of allies and proxies across the Middle East. This includes groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq and Syria, and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. The message is clear: strike Iran, and you risk setting the entire region ablaze. Now, let's examine the American perspective. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, has maintained a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, though its form has evolved. His administration has consistently labeled Iran as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. The recent protests inside Iran, which began over economic grievances but quickly turned political, presented a new flashpoint. President Trump has vocally supported the protesters, framing the Iranian government's crackdown as a brutal suppression of human rights. His threat of military intervention was a direct response to that internal crisis. However, the strategic calculus is complex. A direct military confrontation with Iran would be a massive undertaking with unpredictable consequences. The U.S. military, while unparalleled, would face a sophisticated adversary with significant asymmetric capabilities, including drones, missiles, and the proxy networks Khamenei just referenced. Furthermore, the American public's appetite for another major war in the Middle East is notoriously low. President Trump himself has often spoken of ending forever wars. So, is this a genuine threat of imminent conflict or a high-stakes game of brinkmanship? Some analysts argue Trump's threats are primarily aimed at bolstering the protest movement and forcing the regime to the negotiating table from a position of weakness. Others see it as a consistent part of his administration's confrontational posture, where the threat of force is used to achieve diplomatic and strategic objectives without necessarily pulling the trigger. The key question is, where is the red line? What specific action by Iran would trigger an American military response? The ambiguity itself is a source of danger. To understand the potential scale of a regional war, we must look at the chessboard of Middle Eastern alliances. Iran is not isolated. It is the centerpiece of what is often called the axis of resistance, a coalition of state and non-state actors opposed to American and Israeli influence in the region. Let's break down this network. First, Hezbollah in Lebanon. It is arguably the world's most heavily armed non-state actor, with a vast arsenal of rockets and missiles capable of striking deep into Israel. In any conflict, Hezbollah would almost certainly open a second front against Israel, transforming a U.S.-Iran clash into a wider regional conflagration. Second, various Shia militias in Iraq, many of which are backed by Iran. These groups have repeatedly targeted U.S. forces stationed in Iraq. A war would see a dramatic escalation of attacks, potentially forcing a full-scale American invasion or a humiliating withdrawal. Third, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. They have demonstrated the capability to strike critical infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates with drones and missiles. They could unleash a barrage, targeting oil facilities and destabilizing global energy markets. Fourth, Syria, where Iranian forces and proxies are deeply embedded, supporting the Assad regime. This network gives Iran strategic depth and multiple avenues to retaliate. The warning from Khamenei is a promise to activate all these nodes simultaneously. The result would not be a clean, surgical strike. It would be a messy, multi-front war with catastrophic humanitarian and economic consequences, likely spiking oil prices and triggering a global recession. This brings us to a critical and uncomfortable question for America's allies. Which side would you choose? The warning from Tehran is also a message to capitals in Europe, the Gulf, and Asia. In the event of war, neutrality may not be an option. Traditional U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel would be primary targets for Iranian retaliation. They would be forced into the conflict whether they wanted it or not. For European powers like the UK, France, and Germany, the dilemma is acute. They have sought to preserve the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, from which the U.S. withdrew under Trump. They have economic interests in the region and fear a massive refugee crisis. Would they support American military action or try to restrain Washington? The division could fracture the Western alliance. Then there are global powers like China and Russia. Both have significant economic and strategic ties with Iran. Russia, in particular, has grown closer to Tehran since its invasion of Ukraine, with Iran supplying drones and other military equipment. A U.S.-Iran war could provide an opportunity for Moscow to further undermine American influence, or it could draw Russia into a dangerous confrontation. For nations like Kenya, watching from afar, the implications are still profound. A regional war would disrupt global trade routes, cause massive volatility in energy and food prices, and create yet another epicenter of instability in an already unstable world. The economic fallout would be felt everywhere. Let's look at some hard numbers to understand the human cost already in play, which forms the backdrop to this crisis. The recent protests inside Iran, which sparked President Trump's threats, were met with a severe crackdown by security forces. While exact figures are difficult to verify due to government censorship, human rights groups have been piecing together a grim picture. According to credible estimates from organizations like Amnesty International and Iran Human Rights, the number of people killed in the suppression of protests since they reignited last month is significant. We can visualize one key metric that underscores the scale of the domestic unrest that triggered this international crisis.